The mountain estate near Aspen was more of a monument than a home, a fortress of glass and steel designed to keep the world out. For Arthur Blackwood, it was a self-imposed exile, a place to recover from the heart attack that had nearly claimed him. He had built this place as a testament to his success, but now, walking the sterile halls, the silence felt less like peace and more like an echo of his own emptiness. Outside, the Rockies stood majestic and wild, a vibrant living world that made the cold, minimalist interior feel like a tomb. Every designer chair, every polished surface, was a reminder of a life meticulously curated but devoid of warmth. He had come here seeking the quiet he thought he needed, but the oppressive order of the house only amplified the hollowness within him. His world of calculated silence shattered the moment he stepped through the front door. The air, which should have been still and filtered, carried the warm, unfamiliar scent of baked apples and cinnamon. A small, brightly colored ball lay abandoned on the polished concrete floor, a glaring violation of the home's stark aesthetic. Then he heard it, a sound so foreign in these walls it felt like an auditory hallucination, the high-pitched, joyful laughter of a child. It wasn't a mistake, it was an invasion. A cold, precise fury began to build in his chest, displacing the chronic exhaustion. This was his sanctuary, his sterile refuge, and someone had dared to defile it with life. He moved deeper into the house, his expensive leather shoes making no sound, his entire being focused on confronting and expelling the source of this chaos. He found them in the grand living room, a space meant to display art, not harbor a family. Eleanor Vance stood there, a woman he vaguely recognized from a past cleaning service, her face pale with terror. Huddled behind her were two small children, a boy of about 10 and a younger girl, their play abruptly silenced by his presence. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He had learned long ago that power was most effective when delivered with cold precision. He spoke of trespassing, of calling the authorities, his words like shards of ice. He watched her tremble, saw the desperate, jumbled explanation forming on her lips, but he gave her no room to speak. He was in command here. He was the master of this cold, empty castle, and he was about to restore its perfect, lifeless order. Just as his rage was about to crest, a small movement broke the tense standoff. The little girl, Sophie, emerged from behind her mother's legs, her expression one of simple curiosity, not fear. She took a few hesitant steps forward and held up a piece of paper, a child's drawing in waxy, vibrant crayon. It depicted a lopsided house under a smiling sun, with 4 stick figures holding hands. She offered it to him. The innocent gesture struck Arthur with a force his recent medical emergency couldn't match. He looked from the crude drawing to the terrified family, and in that single, crushing moment, he saw a reflection of everything his fortune had never bought him. A home. Stories like this, where one small act of humanity can change a life, are why we feel compelled to share them. If this one touches you, subscribing to our channel helps us continue to tell them. That initial, grudging permission hung in the air, a fragile truce in the silent war between his orderly world and their chaotic existence. Arthur retreated to his study, a room lined with books he never read, and watched them from a distance. He saw Eleanor moving with a quiet efficiency, erasing the traces of their life as if trying to make them invisible. He heard the muffled sounds of children's play, a foreign language in a house that had only ever known the hum of climate control and the solitary clink of ice in a glass. This wasn't pity he felt. It was a strange, selfish curiosity. He was a scientist observing a vibrant, unknown species that had colonized his sterile habitat, and for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend, he found himself unwilling to exterminate the experiment. He had spent a lifetime building walls, not of steel and glass, but of emotional detachment. It had started in a childhood home that was as meticulously organized and emotionally barren as the one he now occupied. His parents had provided for his every material need, but had treated affection as an unseemly display, a vulnerability to be avoided. Later, a bitter divorce had reinforced the lesson. Love was a liability, a messy variable in the clean equation of success. He had walled off his heart so thoroughly that his near-fatal cardiac event had felt less like a medical emergency and more like a mechanical failure. Now, watching this small, struggling family, he felt the first faint tremors in those long fortified foundations, a terrifying and unwelcome sensation he instinctively wanted to crush. Eleanor carried her own history of loss, a story etched in the faint lines around her tired but gentle eyes. Her husband, a construction worker with a laugh that could fill a room, had been taken by a sudden accident just a year prior. His paycheck had been their only lifeline. After his death, the world had unraveled with brutal speed. The eviction notice, the dwindling savings, the nights spent in their car with Liam trying to be brave for his little sister. She remembered cleaning this cavernous house once, a one-day job, and thinking it was so vast and empty, no one would ever notice if a small, broken family took refuge in one of its forgotten corners. It was a desperate, lawless act, born not of malice but of a mother's fierce, primal need to shield her children from the cold. The first few days were a dance of careful avoidance. Eleanor instructed the children to play quietly, to treat the house like a museum where their very presence was a disturbance. Liam, a boy old enough to understand the precarity of their situation, watched Arthur with a wary, protective gaze, his hand often finding his sister's. Sophie, however, was too young for such anxieties. She would occasionally wander near where Arthur sat, a small, colourful spectre in his monochrome world, before her mother would gently steer her away with a whispered apology. Arthur said little, his observations masked by a stern expression, but he noticed everything. The way Eleanor saved half of her own small meal for Liam, the quiet way Sophie would hum to herself while she drew, filling the silence with a soft, unassuming melody. The shift happened on the third evening. The aroma of a simple stew, rich with vegetables and herbs, permeated the house, an olfactory assault on its sterile purity. Arthur emerged from his study, intending to eat his usual pre-packaged, nutritionally balanced meal alone. But the sight of the three of them at the massive dining table, looking so small and out of place, stopped him. On impulse, an act wholly out of character, he sat down at the far end of the table. Eleanor froze, terrified she had overstepped. But then Liam, trying to break the heavy silence, told a clumsy joke about a penguin. The punchline was nonsensical, but Sophie's resulting giggle was infectious. To his own profound shock, Arthur felt the corner of his mouth twitch into a smile, a real one. That shared meal became a hesitant routine. Arthur found himself learning the rhythm of their lives. He discovered that Liam was fascinated by engineering, capable of building intricate structures out of discarded packaging, his quiet focus a mirror of Arthur's own. He learned that Sophie believed squirrels held secret meetings to plan out the winter, and that she drew her family, always with a bright yellow sun, smiling down on them. He saw Eleanor not as a charity case, but as a woman of immense fortitude, creating a world of love and stability for her children out of the wreckage of her life. The cold respect he initially felt was slowly, imperceptibly thawing into something that felt dangerously like affection, a warmth spreading through the cold chambers of his heart. Eleanor, however, remained guarded. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with strings attached, that stability could be snatched away in an instant. Arthur's generosity was a terrifying puzzle. She couldn't understand his motives, and that uncertainty made it impossible to relax, to let her children fully believe this was a safe harbor. She feared the moment he would grow tired of them, the day his mood would shift and they would be cast out again, leaving her children with yet another scar, another loss. So she held a part of herself back, her gratitude always tinged with the fear of the inevitable goodbye, a wall she maintained to protect her children's hearts and her own. The outside world eventually intruded, as it always does. A call from Arthur's lawyer, a man whose voice was as polished and cold as the granite countertops, brought the situation into sharp focus. He spoke of liability, of legal exposure, of the unseemly appearance of harboring squatters. The words were a cold splash of reality, reminding Arthur of the world he belonged to, a world that had no place for messy, inconvenient humanity. It's hard to stand for what feels right when everyone around you insists it's wrong. So many stories like this end because of that pressure. And if you believe these moments of connection are worth fighting for, your subscription helps us keep sharing the ones that don't. The lawyer's disapproval only served to harden something in Arthur, a nascent defiance against the cold logic he had once lived by. The first true test arrived not from a lawyer, but in the form of a child's fever. Sophie's bright energy began to dim, replaced by a lethargy and a persistent cough that echoed ominously in the vast, quiet rooms. Eleanor's face grew tight with a familiar dread, the fear of a parent with no insurance and no safety net. She tried to soothe the fever with cool cloths and whispered reassurances, but the child's skin grew hotter, her breathing more labored. The house, once a symbol of sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them with a crisis they had no resources to fight. The sterile, controlled environment Arthur had built offered no comfort, no remedy for the raw, uncontrollable reality of a sick child. For Arthur, the sight of the suffering child was a visceral echo of his own recent brush with mortality. He remembered the sterile smell of the hospital, the feeling of his own body betraying him, the profound, terrifying helplessness. He saw that same vulnerability in Sophie's small, flushed face, and it stirred a feeling that was part terror and part furious, protective instinct. This was not a business problem to be managed or a legal issue to be delegated. This was life, fragile and precious, unfolding in his home. The cold detachment he had cultivated for decades was useless against the primal fear he felt watching her struggle for breath. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant in their crisis. When Eleanor found him standing in the doorway of Sophie's room late that night, her face was a mask of exhausted despair. "Her fever is worse," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what to do." In that moment, the last of Arthur Blackwood, the titan of finance, the master of control, fell away. He saw only a terrified mother and a sick child. "Get your coats," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. It was not a suggestion. It was a command born of a newfound purpose. He moved with a decisiveness he hadn't felt in years, gently lifting the feverish girl from her bed and wrapping her in a thick cashmere blanket from his own closet, the soft luxury a stark contrast to their desperate situation. The journey down the winding mountain road was a blur of darkness and high beams. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, silent, her hands twisting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the reflection of her daughter in the window. Arthur drove with a focused intensity, his powerful car eating up the miles. He glanced at the small, still form in the back seat, then at the woman beside him, her profile illuminated by the dashboard's faint glow. The immense gulf between their two worlds had vanished, erased by the urgency of a shared human fear. They were no longer a billionaire and a destitute widow. They were simply two people, bound by a fragile thread of hope, racing against time toward a light in the distance, praying it wasn't too late. The hospital corridor was a sterile white canyon, smelling of antiseptic and anxiety. Arthur had never felt more out of place, yet more certain of where he needed to be. He had spent his life in boardrooms where power was a currency, and control was the ultimate goal. But here, none of that mattered. He watched Eleanor pace, her small frame a taut wire of fear, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He had made the calls, leveraged his name, and ensured Sophie had the best pediatric specialist in the state. But all his influence felt like a blunt instrument against the delicate fragility of a child's life. He wasn't a commander here. He was a sentry, standing guard over a flickering flame of hope, his own heart aching with a terror that was entirely new to him, a selfless fear for someone else. For 2 days, they existed in that suspended reality of waiting. Time was measured not in hours, but in the rhythmic beeps of distant machines and the hushed footsteps of nurses. Arthur ensured Eleanor ate, bringing her food she barely touched, and coffee she held for warmth. He sat with her in the uncomfortable plastic chairs, the silence between them filled with a shared, unspoken dread. Late on the second night, her composure finally shattered. Sobs racked her body, quiet and desperate. "I can't thank you enough, Arthur," she whispered through her tears, looking at him with a gratitude that felt like a chasm between them. "You've done so much for us, for strangers." The word hung in the air, a painful reminder of how this all began, and Arthur knew he couldn't let it stand. He moved to sit beside her, his voice uncharacteristically gentle but firm. "No, Eleanor, don't thank me." He looked away for a moment, down the long, empty corridor, gathering the courage to voice the truth that had been solidifying in his chest. "You have it all wrong. I should be thanking you." He turned back, his eyes meeting hers, raw and exposed. "Before you and the children came, my house wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum I had built for myself. I was just waiting to die in it. You didn't just move into my house, you brought life back into mine." It's these powerful moments of raw honesty that show us what truly matters. We're committed to finding these stories, and when you subscribe, you help us share them. Eleanor stared at him, her tears slowing as she absorbed his words. She saw no pity in his gaze, only a profound, aching sincerity that mirrored the fear and hope in her own heart. The immense power and wealth that had once intimidated her seemed to melt away, revealing the man underneath, a man who was just as lost as she had been, a man who was fighting for his family. In that instant, the last of her defenses crumbled. She wasn't a charity case, and he wasn't a benefactor. They were two people bound together by a fierce, protective love for two small children. Just then, a doctor in blue scrubs emerged from Sophie's room, his expression unreadable, and for a heart-stopping second, the world seemed to stop spinning as they both rose to their feet. The doctor's words were a gentle wave of relief that washed over them, cleansing the fear and exhaustion of the past 48 hours. "The fever has broken. She's responding to the treatment. She's going to be okay." The air left Eleanor's lungs in a shuddering gasp, and her legs gave way. Arthur caught her, pulling her into an embrace that was anything but formal. It was desperate and solid, a collision of relief and gratitude. She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder, her sobs now of pure, unadulterated joy. He held her tightly, his own eyes burning with unshed tears, his hand stroking her hair. In the cold, sterile hallway of a hospital, surrounded by the scent of medicine and the quiet hum of life-saving machines, Arthur Blackwood finally truly came home. The drive back to the mountain estate was different. The silence in the car was no longer tense, but filled with a quiet shared relief. When they walked through the front door, the house itself seemed to have exhaled. It was no longer a cold monument to wealth, but a backdrop for a life that was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Arthur dismantled his old world with the same precision he had used to build it. He initiated the sale of his majority stake in the firm, an act that sent shockwaves through the financial world, but felt to him like shedding a heavy, ill-fitting coat. He replaced stark, minimalist art with frames holding Sophie's crayon drawings and photos of Liam's latest engineering marvels. The oppressive silence was permanently broken by the sounds of a family, laughter echoing in the grand hall, the low murmur of a bedtime story, the simple, beautiful chaos of living. The most significant change, however, was not in the decor or his business portfolio, but in the legal documents he pursued with unwavering focus. The adoption process was a journey through paperwork and court dates, but for Arthur, it was the most important negotiation of his life. He sat in a sterile courtroom, a place not unlike the boardrooms he once commanded, but the stakes were infinitely higher. When the judge's gavel fell, officially making Liam and Sophie his children, he felt a profound sense of victory that dwarfed any corporate takeover. He looked at Eleanor, her eyes shining with tears of joy, and understood that he wasn't just giving these children his name. They were giving him a legacy of love, a purpose that would outlast any fortune. He was no longer just Arthur Blackwood. He was a father. Together, he and Eleanor built something new, born from the ashes of their old lives. Inspired by her resilience and his newfound purpose, they established the Vance Blackwood Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing safe housing and comprehensive support for widowed and single mothers who had fallen through society's cracks. Eleanor, with her first-hand knowledge of the fear and desperation these women faced, was the heart of the operation, while Arthur provided the resources and strategic vision. They built it on the simple, powerful truth they had both learned in that vast mountain house, that a safe harbor can change the entire trajectory of a life. It's a truth we see confirmed in so many powerful accounts, and your subscription is what allows us to continue building a space to share them with the world. Years later, one could find Arthur not in an office overlooking a city skyline, but on the sprawling lawn of his home, watching a teenage Liam teach a vibrant, healthy Sophie how to fly a kite. His hair was grayer, his movements slower, but his eyes held a light that had been absent for decades. He and Eleanor would sit on the porch, her hand resting comfortably in his, observing the happy mess of their life. The mountain estate was no longer a fortress to keep the world out, but a home filled with warmth and connection. Arthur Blackwood had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, only to discover in the end that true riches had nothing to do with money. It was the priceless, simple, and profound feeling of being exactly where you were always meant to be.